The night my father handed my brother the keys to a company I had spent 5 years building from the inside, Colton raised glasses in my direction and winked. I did not throw my drink. I did not walk out. I simply set my champagne on the tray of a passing waiter and smiled back. What Colton did not know, what none of them knew, was that the firm they were celebrating that evening was already, quietly, partly mine, and one phone call, exactly 1 year later, was going to confirm what I had known all along. Before I continue, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the most qualified person in the room and still been passed over. My name is Heather Richardson, and I am 32 years old. I know what you are thinking. A last name like Richardson, a father who built one of the most respected mid-market private equity firms in Greenwich, Connecticut. I must have had every door open before I ever knocked, and in some ways, that is true. But doors that open for the wrong reasons have a way of closing just as fast, and my father was a man who believed, down to the marrow of his bones, that a firm like Richardson Capital needed a certain kind of leader at its helm. He meant a son. He had always meant a son. Richardson Capital Group was founded in 1991 in a one-room office above a dry cleaner on Post Road. My father built it with a legal pad, a phone, and 30 years of stubbornness. By the time I was in high school, the firm managed close to $800 million in assets across 11 portfolio companies. By the time I graduated from Harvard Business School, top 9% of my class, with a concentration in corporate finance, it was nudging past $1.2 billion. I had watched that growth from the inside my entire life. I had eaten dinner at a table where the conversation was always about deal flow, risk exposure, and quarterly performance. I did not stumble into finance, I was built for it. I joined Richardson Capital at 26. Not through a side door, not with a reduced workload. I came in as a senior analyst and I worked. I mean that in the way people use the word when they are trying to describe something that consumes more than just hours. I worked the way you work when you have something to prove and no one is watching to give you credit. My division handled operational oversight for 3 of the firm's portfolio companies. Within 18 months, 2 of them had moved from underperforming to top quartile. The third had been restructured and sold at a 31% premium over its projected exit value. My father noticed. He said so exactly once over a Sunday dinner in the Hamptons, in the way he complimented things he did not entirely want to acknowledge. A brief nod, a single sentence, then back to his steak. You have good instincts, he said. That was it. That was the whole of it. Colton joined the firm 2 years after me. He was 24, had left Dartmouth in his junior year after what my mother described as a difficult semester, and had spent the intervening time doing something loosely described as consulting for a friend's startup in Austin. He did not have an MBA. He could not, when I tested him quietly at a family dinner, correctly identify the difference between EBITDA and free cash flow. He was charming, though. He had our father's jaw and our grandfather's handshake, and a laugh that made clients feel they were the only person in the room. That was the thing about Colton. He made people feel good. He made my father feel, I think, like he was looking at a younger version of himself, which was not accurate, but it did not need to be accurate to be powerful. The firm had what I came to think of as 2 sets of rules. There was the set of rules for Colton, flexible, generous, built on potential and personality, and there was the set of rules for me, precise, demanding, built on proof. I had to document everything. I had to show my reasoning in triplicate. I had to arrive first and leave last, and still manage to somehow not seem threatening. Colton arrived when he arrived. Colton's ideas were greeted with enthusiasm even when they were half-formed. Colton had a corner office within 8 months of joining. I had moved into mine after 3 years. I am not telling you this to make you angry on my behalf. I made my peace with the imbalance a long time ago, or at least I told myself I had. What I am telling you is that I understood the architecture of the situation very clearly. My father was not a cruel man. He was a man of his generation, with a fixed idea of order, and in his order, a firm like Richardson Capital needed a Richardson man at the top. The thing he did not account for was that I had spent 5 years learning exactly how every single part of that firm functioned. Not the way an heir learns it, from the top down, in broad strokes, with the luxury of delegation. I learned it from the inside out. I knew the legal exposure on 4 of our portfolio companies. I knew which 2 board members had serious reservations about the direction of our largest fund. I knew the salary of every senior employee and the performance metrics of every division. I knew where the bodies were buried, as they say, because I had been the one quietly doing the digging. There was one assignment, though, that nobody else wanted. It had been sitting on the edge of my father's desk for months, getting passed from one associate to the next, like something mildly contagious. A small logistics company called Meridian, one of the firm's oldest portfolio holdings, acquired in 2009, largely forgotten since. It was carrying $4.2 million in net debt, bleeding about $340,000 a quarter, and the prevailing wisdom was that it should be wound down before it cost the firm any more embarrassment. My father handed it to me in November, 6 months before the gala. "Clean it up or close it," he said. "Whichever is faster." I took the folder home that Friday night. I opened it at my kitchen table in Greenwich with a glass of Bordeaux and the kind of focus I reserved for things other people had already given up on. And within 40 minutes I found something that made me set the wine down and reach for my laptop. But I am getting ahead of myself. The Richardson Capital Autumn Gala was held every year on the third Friday of October at the Greenwich Country Club, and it was, by any measure, an event. 200 guests, white tablecloths, candlelight, a string quartet in the corner playing things nobody actually listened to. The kind of room where the men wore watches that cost more than most people's cars, and the women had learned, over decades, exactly how to smile at the right moment and say very little of substance. My mother had mastered that smile. I had never quite managed it. I arrived at 7:20 minutes before the formal program was scheduled to begin. I wore a navy dress, fitted, simple, the kind of thing that reads as composed rather than trying. My hair was up. I had learned years ago that in rooms like this one, the goal was not to be noticed for how you looked but to be taken seriously before you opened your mouth. I said hello to the Hendersons, to two of the firm's independent board members, to the managing partner of a law firm we had worked with for years. I was good at this part. I had grown up in these rooms. My father found me near the bar at 7:15. He looked the way he always looked at these events, tall, silver-haired, entirely at ease in a way that came from 40 years of being the most important person in any room he entered. He kissed my cheek. He told me I looked well. He asked if I had reviewed the Meridian quarterly before coming. I told him I had. He nodded once and moved on to speak to someone else, and I stood there for a moment holding my champagne, understanding with a quiet, settled clarity that whatever was going to happen tonight, my father had already decided. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, before the sky has done anything visible. Colton found me at 7:40. He was in a tuxedo that fit him the way things always fit Colton, effortlessly, as though the universe arranged itself around him out of basic courtesy. He was with two men I didn't recognize, clients probably, both of them laughing at something he had just said. He broke away when he saw me, came over, and put his arm around my shoulders, in the loose, easy way of someone who has never once considered that physical space might belong to another person. "You look great," he said. He meant it, I think. Colton was not malicious by nature. He was simply unaware, in the profound and total way that people are unaware when they have never once been required to pay attention. "You too," I said. He leaned in slightly. "Dad's going to make an announcement tonight." "I know," I said. He looked at me for a moment, and something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, more like mild surprise that I was not more visibly upset. Then he smiled, and it was a good smile, his best one, the one that had been charming people since he was 7 years old. "It's going to be good, Heather. For the firm. For all of us." I looked at him. I did not say anything. At 8 o'clock, Gerald Richardson took the microphone. He thanked the guests. He talked about the firm's history, its values, the relationships that had sustained it across 3 decades. He talked about legacy, that word, legacy, which I had heard him use my entire life, always in connection with the firm, always in a way that suggested it was something that would be passed down rather than built fresh. He talked about the next chapter. Then he said Colton's name. He said it with a warmth I had heard him use for very few things. His Labrador, the Hamptons house. And now this. He said Colton had the vision and the temperament to take Richardson Capital into its next era. He said the board had been consulted and was in full support. He said, effective the first of the year, Colton Richardson would assume the role of chief executive officer. 200 people applauded. I applauded too. My hands moved and the sound they made was indistinguishable from everyone else's in the room, which was the point. I looked at my father while I clapped. He was looking at Colton. He did not look at me once during the entire announcement, not before it, not during it, not after. I do not know if he was avoiding my eyes, or if it simply did not occur to him to check whether I was still in the room. Colton took the microphone. He was good at this. The speaking part, warm, self-deprecating in the calculated way of someone who knows it will be received well. He thanked the board. He thanked the team. He thanked my father. Then he looked across the room in my direction and raised his glass. And to my sister Heather he said, "Who keeps the engine running? We couldn't do any of this without you." The room turned briefly toward me. Polite smiles. A few small nods. I raised my glass back. I held my expression exactly where I wanted it. Composed, warm, unreadable. The string quartet started up again. Conversation resumed. The moment passed the way those moments do, cleanly and completely, as though it had not happened at all. My father found me 20 minutes later near the coat check, where I had gone to retrieve my phone from my clutch. "I should have told you earlier," he said. It was the closest he would come to an apology, and we both understood that. "It's fine, Dad. I'm moving you to Director of Special Projects. It's an important role. The firm needs someone who can." "Dad," I looked at him. "It's fine." He studied my face for a moment. I have no idea what he saw there. Then he nodded, the same single nod he had given me over the Sunday dinner in the Hamptons, and walked back toward the party. I stood in the corridor, outside the coat check for approximately 90 seconds. The carpet was burgundy. There was a painting of a harbor on the wall that I had walked past 100 times without ever looking at. I looked at it now, small boats, calm water, a horizon that went nowhere in particular. Then I picked up my phone, went back inside, finished my drink, said goodbye to the people I needed to say goodbye to, and drove home. I did not cry on the drive. I did not call anyone. I turned the radio off and drove the 12 minutes back to my house in the kind of silence that is not empty but full of calculation, of rearrangement, of something that was not quite a plan yet but was becoming one. Meridian's folder was still open on my kitchen table where I had left it Friday night. I sat down in front of it, loosened my earrings, and went back to work. I want to be precise about what happened in the weeks after the gala, because people tend to fill in that kind of story with rage or tears, or some dramatic midnight decision made in a bathrobe. The truth was quieter than that, and I think the quiet was the most important part. I went to work on Monday morning the same way I had gone to work every Monday morning for 5 years. I parked in the same spot, I took the same elevator, I said good morning to the same people. My title had changed, Director of Special Projects. A role that had no org chart box, no direct reports, no budget line. But my office was the same, my badge still worked, and nobody had yet figured out exactly what the new designation meant in practice. That ambiguity was, I would later understand, one of the greatest gifts my father ever accidentally gave me. Colton's transition into the CEO role began officially on the 2nd of January. In the interim, he was what the internal memo called CEO designate, which in practice meant he attended every meeting my father attended and began signing off on decisions he did not yet fully understand. I watched this from a careful distance. I did not offer unsolicited opinions. I answered questions when asked, completely and accurately, and did not editorialize. The Monday after the gala, I requested a formal meeting with my father. He gave me 30 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon. His assistant, Sandra, had worked for him for 19 years, and looked at me, with the particular expression she reserved, for things she considered a waste of Gerald Richardson's time. I sat down across from his desk, the same mahogany desk he had brought from the original Post Road office, the one thing he had refused to replace through 3 renovations, and I told him I wanted to formally request reassignment, not to another firm, not a demotion. I wanted my title to carry actual authority, a defined scope, direct reporting lines. He listened. He leaned back in his chair with his hands folded, the way he listened to things he had already decided not to do. "The Director of Special Projects role," he said, "is exactly what the name suggests. High-priority work that doesn't fit neatly into the existing structure. It reports directly to me." "There's no budget," I said. "There are no direct reports." "There is no defined deliverable, Meridian," he said. "That's your deliverable." I looked at him for a moment. "You want me to spend an indefinite amount of time cleaning up a logistics company with $4 million in net debt. I want you to handle it however you see fit," he said. "You have full discretion on Meridian. Restructure it, wind it down, find a buyer. Whatever the analysis supports." He paused. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Heather." It was the second closest he had come to an apology. "I'll take care of Meridian," I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and left. In the elevator on the way back to my floor, I made the decision. Not the decision about Meridian. That one I had already made the night of the gala, sitting at my kitchen table in my navy dress with my earrings off, staring at a federal procurement database that most people in private equity had never bothered to look at. The decision I made in that elevator was the other one, the one that would take 12 months to execute and would require a level of patience I was not entirely certain I possessed. I was going to buy the firm, not all of it, not loudly. Not in a way that anyone would notice until it was too late to matter. I had spent 7 years living carefully, a modest house by Greenwich standards, no second property, no expensive habits. I had $340,000 in liquid savings, a brokerage account worth just over $200,000, and a line of credit I had never touched. It was not enough on its own. But I knew the Richardson Capital cap table the way I knew my own handwriting, and I knew that 3 minority shareholders had been quietly looking to exit for over a year. 2 of them had mentioned it to me directly. In the offhand way people mention things to the person they consider the institutional memory of an organization. They had not mentioned it to Colton. Colton did not know their names well enough to have those conversations. I called a lawyer that evening, not the firm's outside counsel, a separate attorney, a woman named Patricia Wald, who had been 2 years ahead of me at Harvard and now ran a boutique corporate practice in Midtown. I told her what I was thinking. She was quiet for a long moment. "You understand this needs to be clean," she said. "Arm's length, fully disclosed to the board when the time comes. No fiduciary issues, I understand. And you're certain about the numbers?" "I'm certain about the numbers." Another pause. "All right," she said. "Let me look at the cap table and come back to you by Friday." I hung up and sat for a moment in my car, in the Richardson Capital parking garage, the engine off, the concrete around me, the particular gray of things that have been standing too long without anyone paying attention. Then I picked up the Meridian folder from the passenger seat and went back upstairs, because here is what I had found the Friday night before the gala, 40 minutes into the file, with my Bordeaux sitting untouched beside me. Meridian Logistics had a federal contract, not a current one, a lapsed one from 2019, for regional freight coordination with a GSA-affiliated agency in the Mid-Atlantic corridor. The contract had expired, had not been renewed, and had been listed in Meridian's records as terminated. But the GSA solicitation database, which I had pulled up as routine due diligence, showed something different. The agency had reissued the contract opportunity in August of that year. It was still open. The bid window closed in 6 weeks. The contract value was $18.3 million over 3 years. Nobody at Richardson Capital knew it existed. Nobody had looked, because nobody had expected Meridian to be worth looking at. I spent that weekend rebuilding Meridian's operational model from scratch. I pulled their carrier contracts, their route data, their compliance certifications. The certifications were current. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was the margin structure. At full contract capacity, Meridian would generate approximately $2.1 million in annual EBITDA. Not transformative for a firm managing $1.2 billion, but not nothing either. More importantly, a profitable Meridian with a federal contract was a Meridian worth something on the open market. Worth considerably more than the write-down figure currently sitting in the firm's internal models. I did not tell my father. I did not tell Colton. I called Meridian's general manager, a quiet, competent man named Roy Delaney, who had been running the day-to-day operation for 11 years and had long since stopped expecting anyone from the parent firm to show up with anything other than bad news. He picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Delaney," I said. "This is Heather Richardson. I've been assigned to Meridian full-time. I'd like to come down Tuesday morning and go through everything with you directly." A pause. "Everything?" "Everything," I said. He let out a long breath that sounded less like exhaustion and more like something cautiously adjacent to relief. "I'll have coffee ready," he said. I smiled. It was the first real one I had managed in 4 days. The Meridian Logistics facility sat on 12 acres off Route 1 in a part of New Jersey that had not yet decided whether it was industrial or suburban and had settled uncomfortably on both. The building was a low, wide structure. Corrugated metal siding painted a shade of green that had once been intentional and was now simply weathered. The parking lot had 3 trucks, a forklift that appeared to be retired rather than parked, and a flagpole with a flag that needed replacing. I pulled in on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 weeks after the gala, in a light rain, and sat for a moment looking at it through my windshield. I had seen prettier assets. I had also seen worse ones turn into something worth owning. Roy Delaney was waiting at the front entrance with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had learned not to hope for things, but had not entirely stopped. He was 61, broad-shouldered, with the careful diction of someone who had spent decades translating between operations people and finance people and trusted neither group completely. He handed me the coffee, shook my hand with a firm, dry grip, and walked me inside without preamble. We spent 4 hours going through everything. Roy had been running Meridian the way a good caretaker runs a house that nobody lives in, keeping the pipes from freezing, making sure the structure stayed sound, not spending money he didn't have on improvements nobody would notice. The books were clean, messy in places, understaffed in others, but clean. No hidden liabilities beyond what the Richardson Capital file already showed. The $4.2 million in net debt was real, but it was structured debt, patient debt. A term loan from a regional bank that had been rolled twice and had another 14 months before it required any decision. The staff was 11 people. All of them had been there at least 4 years. 3 of them had been there longer than Roy. Nobody had quit in 18 months, which in a company this size, in this much financial uncertainty, told me something important about the man standing next to me, showing me freight manifests. After the books, we walked the floor. Roy explained the routing system, the carrier relationships, the compliance documentation. He walked me through the certification renewals, which were current through the following March. He showed me the operations manual, which he had updated himself on his own time, using a template he had downloaded from a Logistics Industry Association website, because, as he put it, somebody ought to write it down before I get hit by a bus. Then I showed him what I had found. I pulled up the GSA solicitation on my laptop at his desk, turned the screen toward him, and watched his face. He leaned forward, read for a moment, leaned back. "That's our old contract," he said. "It's a reissue," I said. "They put it back out for bid in August. The window closes in 37 days. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. The fluorescent light above his desk buzzed faintly. Outside, a truck reversed somewhere in the yard, its backup signal a flat, mechanical pulse. "We have the certifications," he said finally. "You have the certifications. You have the route infrastructure. You have 11 years of performance history on that exact corridor. We don't have the working capital to bid at full capacity." "I know," I said. "I'm working on that." He looked at me with the careful, measuring look of someone deciding whether to believe a thing they very much want to be true. "Miss Richardson, I've had 4 people from that firm come through here in the last 3 years. Every single one of them left with a recommendation to wind us down. I'm not recommending anything yet," I said. "I'm asking you to give me 37 days." Another long pause. Then Roy Delaney picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. 37 days, he said. I flew back to New York that evening. The following morning, I called Patricia Wald and added a second item to our agenda. The capital structure I needed for the GSA bid required Meridian to show $800,000 in unrestricted cash reserves, a standard federal contractor requirement that the company currently could not meet. Richardson Capital could have provided a simple intercompany loan to cover it. I did not ask them to, because asking meant telling Colton, and telling Colton meant the decision going into a committee that would spend 6 weeks deliberating before recommending they do nothing. Instead, I used my own money. Not directly, Patricia structured it as a secured bridge loan from a holding entity she helped me establish, Clearwater Advisory LLC, to Meridian Logistics, at market rate interest, fully documented. Richardson Capital's board would be informed at the appropriate time, as required by the firm's related party transaction policy. Everything above board. Everything clean. I wired $280, thou zero'n, on a Thursday afternoon and watched the confirmation appear on my screen with the particular feeling of a person who has just stepped off a ledge and is waiting to find out if there is ground beneath them. Then I went back to work. Roy and I spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding Meridian's bid package from scratch. I drove down 3 times. We pulled carrier rate cards, rebuilt the cost model, drafted the technical response, and went through 4 rounds of revision on the past performance narrative. Roy wrote the operational sections himself in plain, precise language that said exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. I handled the financial exhibits and the compliance certifications. We submitted the bid on a Wednesday morning, 11 days before the window closed, which is the only sensible time to submit anything, early enough to fix errors, late enough that you have used every available day to make it right. Then we waited. In the meantime, Patricia had identified the 3 minority shareholders who wanted to exit their Richardson Capital positions. The largest held 1%, a retired partner named Howard Fitch, who had been with the firm in its early years and now lived in Scottsdale, and had been trying to liquidate his stake for 18 months without finding a buyer at a price he considered fair. The second held 5.3%. The third held 3.3%. Together, they represented 14.7% of the firm's outstanding equity. The conversations were quiet, brief, and conducted entirely through Patricia. Nobody at Richardson Capital was informed, because the firm's shareholder agreement required disclosure only upon completion of a transfer, not during negotiation. I was not violating anything, I was simply being thorough. Howard Fitch accepted our first offer. The second shareholder needed 2 conversations. The third took 3 weeks and 1 small price adjustment. By the time the GSA sent its preliminary award notification, a Tuesday morning in February, 4 months after the gala, an email to Roy that he forwarded to me in its entirety with no subject line and no message, just the forward. The paperwork on all 3 transactions was complete. I read the award notification twice. Then I called Roy. He picked up on the first ring. 18.3 million, he said. His voice was steady but only just. 18.3 million, I said, a pause. I heard him exhale. What do we do now? He asked. Now, I said, we run a company. What Richardson Capital's internal systems showed, as of that February, was a portfolio holding called Meridian Logistics that had stopped bleeding money and was showing its first positive cash flow quarter in 4 years. A modest improvement, noteworthy perhaps, in a quarterly report. Certainly not the kind of thing that demanded immediate attention from a CEO designate who was busy approving the design specs for his new corner office furniture. What Richardson Capital's internal systems did not show was that Clearwater Advisory LLC had quietly become the registered holder of 14.7% of Richardson Capital Group's total outstanding equity, and what nobody in that building understood yet, not my father, not Colton, not Sandra, with her 19 years and her carefully calibrated expressions, was that the woman they had put in charge of the asset nobody wanted had just turned it into the most valuable thing she owned. Spring came to Greenwich, the way it always does. Gradually, then suddenly, the forsythia along the stone walls going yellow overnight, and the country club reopening its terrace for Saturday lunches, and everyone pretending the winter had not happened. I had always loved that about this part of Connecticut, the seasonal amnesia of it. The way people reset. Colton did not reset. Colton accelerated. The first 90 days of his tenure as CEO designate produced 3 decisions that I would later present, in granular detail, to the firm's independent board members. At the time, I documented each one quietly. The way you document things when you are not yet sure exactly how you will use them, but you are certain that the day will come. The first decision was the dissolution of the firm's internal risk committee. Richardson Capital had maintained a 4-person risk committee since 2008, a direct response to watching other mid-market firms get destroyed by leverage they had not properly stress-tested. My father had built it himself after a difficult year and considered it one of the structural achievements of the firm. Colton dissolved it in February on the grounds that it was, in his words at a senior staff meeting I attended, a bottleneck that slows down our ability to move on opportunities. He replaced it with a new policy requiring risk sign-off from the CFO alone. The CFO was a careful, competent man named Dennis Park, who had been at the firm for 8 years and who I watched, across the conference table that morning, absorb this information with the expression of someone who has just been handed a weight they did not ask to carry. I wrote it down. Date, decision, attendees, exact language used. The second decision was the office renovation. This one I would not have cataloged on its own. Firms renovate, executives redecorate. It is not inherently a governance failure. What made it notable was the mechanism. Colton approved $1 million in capital expenditure for the executive floor renovation without a board resolution, classifying it as a maintenance expense to keep it below the threshold requiring formal approval. The threshold was $2 million. The invoice, which I obtained through the normal accounts payable process as part of my operational oversight responsibilities, totaled $2.09 million. The difference was $94,000 short of requiring a board vote, which I do not believe was a coincidence. I wrote it down. The third decision was Marcus Greer. Marcus Greer ran a real estate development firm out of Miami called Greer Capital Partners. And he had approached Richardson Capital in January about a co-investment opportunity in a portfolio of distressed commercial properties across 3 southeastern states. The deal memo was aggressive: 70% leverage, optimistic exit assumptions, a GP structure that concentrated fees in ways that were unusual for a firm of our standing. Dennis Park flagged it in writing twice. The second time, Colton overruled him via email, which I also have, and signed a letter of intent committing Richardson Capital to a $14 million co-investment. Marcus Greer, I discovered on a Sunday afternoon with a legal database subscription and 2 hours I had originally planned to spend gardening, had 2 prior entities that had been dissolved under circumstances involving investor complaints to the SEC. Neither complaint had resulted in formal action. Neither had been disclosed in the deal memo. I wrote all of this down too. By April, Colton had settled into the rhythms of the role in the way that people settle into things that have been handed to them. Comfortably, without friction, with the mild conviction that the comfort is deserved. He redecorated his office in a shade of gray that a designer had told him was commanding. He hired a communications firm to manage the firm's social media presence, which had previously had none, because he had read an article on an airplane about personal branding. He began arriving at the office at 9:15, which was 50 minutes later than my father had ever arrived, and leaving at 6, which was 2 hours earlier. He also, in April, had the conversation that I think about most when I think about that spring. It happened at a client dinner at the 21 Club in Manhattan, a thank you event for a group of limited partners who had been with the firm since its early years. I had been included on the invitation. Director of Special Projects, whatever that meant, still nominally part of the senior team. I sat at the far end of the table from Colton, between a retired portfolio company CEO named Walter Hess and a woman named Claire Beaumont, whose family had been investing with Richardson Capital since my father's second year in business. The dinner went well. The food was what it always was at 21. Reliable, expensive, presented with the particular solemnity of a restaurant that has been important for long enough to have forgotten why. Colton held court at his end, telling a story about a recent golf trip that got a good laugh. I talked with Walter about a manufacturing company he had recently consulted for, and with Claire about her daughter's new architecture practice in Portland. It was near the end of the evening, when the table had loosened in the way tables loosen after 2 hours and good wine, that I heard it. One of the limited partners, a younger man named Garrett, who had joined his family office 3 years earlier and was still finding his standing in rooms like this one, asked Colton about the operational side of the portfolio. He meant it as a compliment, a setup for Colton to talk about strategy. But he gestured vaguely in my direction when he said it, as though acknowledging that someone at the table handled that dimension. Colton glanced at me. Then he looked back at Garrett with a smile that was easy and warm, and landed like a small, clean knife. Heather handles the administrative side, he said. Filing, compliance, internal reporting. The senior secretarial function, essentially. We couldn't run without her. The table absorbed this. Walter beside me went very still. Claire Beaumont looked at her wine glass. I reached for my water. I took a sip. I set it down on the white tablecloth with a care that was not visible to anyone watching, but that cost me something nonetheless. I did not correct him. I did not look at him. I finished my water, excused myself graciously to use the restroom, stood alone for a moment in the quiet of the corridor outside, with the dark wood paneling and the framed photographs of decades of important evenings, and I breathed senior secretarial function. I thought about the GSA contract. I thought about the $18.3 million. I thought about the 14.7% of his father's firm sitting in a holding entity that bore no Richardson name. I thought about the 3 independent board members I had been having lunch with, one at a time, every 6 weeks, for the past 4 months. Quiet, unhurried lunches in which I had listened far more than I had spoken and had learned, with precision, exactly where each of them stood on the question of the firm's direction. I smoothed my jacket. I walked back to the table. I sat down, picked up my fork, and finished my dessert. When the car came to take me back to Greenwich that night, I sat in the back seat in the dark and opened a new note on my phone. I typed 2 lines: Colton Richardson, April 14th, the 21 Club, New York City. Senior secretarial function. Then I closed my phone and watched the lights of the bridge go past, one by one, steady and bright, the whole span of it lit up against the black water below. Summer arrived, and the Greer deal began to die the way bad deals die. slowly at first, then in a way that was impossible to ignore. The first sign was a missed milestone payment in June. Marcus Greer's team attributed it to a title insurance delay on one of the southeastern properties, which was plausible enough that Dennis Park accepted the explanation without escalating. The second sign was a revised financial model that Greer's team submitted in July, quietly, as an attachment to a routine update email that had materially different exit assumptions than the original deal memo. The cap rates had been adjusted. The hold period had been extended by 18 months. The projected return, which had been aggressive to begin with, was now barely above Richardson Capital's hurdle rate. I was not on the Greer deal team. I had no formal standing to request the documents. But Dennis Park and I had developed, over the course of Colton's tenure, the kind of quiet professional relationship that forms between two people who are both watching the same thing happen and have separately decided not to say so out loud. He forwarded me the revised model on a Thursday afternoon with no message. I read it that evening at my kitchen table and felt the particular cold clarity of being right about something you had hoped you were wrong about. Marcus Greer, I now understood with certainty, was not a bad businessman who had made optimistic projections. He was something more deliberate than that. The fee structures buried in the revised model told the story: management fees that accrued regardless of performance, a promote structure that captured upside for the GP, even in scenarios where the LPs broke even. It was not illegal exactly. It was the kind of thing that was technically permissible and morally indefensible, and only visible if you knew exactly where to look. I spent a weekend going back through the original deal documentation with Patricia Wald on the phone for 90 minutes on Saturday morning. There was a representation in the deal memo, a standard one, the kind that appears in every investment document and gets read by almost nobody, stating that neither Greer Capital Partners nor its principals had been subject to regulatory inquiry in the preceding 5 years. The two dissolved entities I had found in April predated that window by 7 months on one and 4 months on the other. Whether that made the representation technically accurate was a question for lawyers. Whether it made it honest was not a question at all. I added it to the file by August. The Greer situation had become, internally, something that Colton was managing through the mechanism he applied to most difficulties: optimism, deflection, and the reassignment of responsibility. At a senior team meeting in the third week of August, he described the missed milestone as a timing issue being resolved at the asset level, and said the revised model reflected a more conservative posture that actually reduces our downside. Dennis Park, seated 2 chairs away from me, looked at his notepad. I looked at mine. After the meeting, in the corridor outside the conference room, Colton stopped me. It was the first time in 3 months he had sought me out directly for anything other than pleasantries. He waited until the last of the others had filtered out, then turned to me with the look he used when he needed something. Open, slightly deferential, the charm dialed to a register that acknowledged, without stating, that he wanted a favor. I need the Meridian Q3 numbers pushed back 2 weeks, he said. The board package is getting crowded and I want to lead with the Greer update. I looked at him. The board package is due September 5th. I know when it's due. Meridian's numbers are ready. Pushing them doesn't help the package. It just delays good news. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. I'm asking you to push them, Heather. I understood what he was doing. The Meridian numbers were good, better than good. A profitable subsidiary with a federal contract and improving cash flow was exactly the kind of thing that made the Greer situation look worse by comparison. He did not want the board reading them side by side. I'll push them 2 weeks, I said. He nodded, visibly relieved, and walked away. I went back to my office, closed the door, and called Patricia. He just asked me to delay the Meridian board report, I said. Did you agree? I did. A pause. Why? Because I want him to present the Greer update to the board without Meridian in the package. I want them reading his numbers in isolation, without anything that contextualizes how much worse they are. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's clean, she said. That's actually very clean. It was also the last significant decision I made reactively for the rest of that year. From that point forward, everything I did was deliberate, sequenced, and aimed at a single outcome. I had lunch with each of the 3 independent board members in September. Howard Klein was first, 67, former investment banker, the longest-serving independent on the board, and the one whose opinion carried the most weight with the others. We ate at a quiet Italian place in Westport that he had suggested, and I let him order first and talk first, and I listened with the full attention I had been trained to give, in rooms where the important information was always in what was said second, not first. He talked about the firm's direction, he talked about the Greer situation, which had now been discussed at 2 board calls and resolved nothing. He talked, carefully, about leadership. I did not offer opinions. I asked questions at the end of lunch, over coffee. He looked at me with the direct appraising look of a man who has spent 40 years evaluating people for a living. "You've been very patient," he said. "I'm a Richardson," I said. "We take the long view," he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just gotten his answer. Elena Marsh was second in. 53. Former CFO of a regional bank, the board's audit committee chair, and the person most likely to understand implications of what I was about to show her. I met her for lunch in early October. I brought documents. Not accusations, not a presentation, simply documents, organized and labeled, covering the risk committee dissolution, the renovation expense classification, and the Greer representation issue. I set them on the table and walked her through them in the same tone I would have used to explain a quarterly report. Factual, precise, without drama. She read every page. She asked 4 questions. I answered all of them completely. When she was done, she squared the pages against the table, the way careful people organize things they intend to act on, and looked at me. "When did you start keeping this record?" she asked. "January 2nd, I said. "His first day as CEO designate." She nodded slowly. "And the Clearwater position," she said. It was not quite a question. I had not told her about the 14.7%. I had not told any of them. But Elena Marsh was an audit committee chair, and audit committee chairs read cap tables. "It's fully documented," I said. "Patricia Wald has the complete file. The transfers were arm's length, at fair market value, and will be formally disclosed to the full board at the appropriate time." "Which you consider to be soon," she said. "I consider it to be whenever the board decides it needs to know," I said. "That's the board's decision, not mine." She looked at me for a long moment. Outside the restaurant window, the October light came through the glass at a low angle, the way it does in New England in the fall, flattening everything into gold. "Heather," she said. "How is Meridian performing?" I told her. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she picked up her coffee and was quiet for a moment. "The full board meets November 14th, she said. "I know, I think," she said carefully, "that the agenda may need to be revised." I drove home through the October gold, the leaves coming down on Route 1 in long, slow drifts, and I thought about Roy Delaney showing me freight manifests in the rain, and Howard Fitch in Scottsdale taking a fair price for something he had given up on, and the burgundy carpet outside the coat check at the Greenwich Country Club, and the harbor painting that went nowhere in particular. I thought about a question I wanted to ask the people watching this story. Have you ever had to watch someone take credit for something you built and choose, deliberately, strategically, to say nothing? Because silence is sometimes the most powerful sentence you can construct, and patience is sometimes the most aggressive thing in the room. I pulled into my driveway. I sat for a moment. The lights were on inside. Then I went in and started preparing for November 14th. The Greer deal collapsed on a Wednesday morning in late October. The way things collapse when they have been structurally unsound from the beginning. Not with a single dramatic failure, but with a sequence of smaller ones that arrived in such rapid succession that there was no longer any reasonable way to call them coincidence. The title on the largest of the 3 southeastern properties, a former retail complex outside Charlotte, had a lien that Greer's team had either missed or chosen not to disclose. A second property, in Savannah, had a zoning restriction that made the planned conversion to mixed-use development legally impermissible, without a variance that the county had already denied once. The third property, in Birmingham, was the one that ended it. An environmental assessment conducted by the new lender Greer had brought in to replace the original financing revealed soil contamination requiring remediation estimated at between $800,000 and $2.3 million, depending on the scope of the work. Greer's team notified Richardson Capital at 9 in the morning. By 10:30, Dennis Park was in Colton's office. By noon, Colton had called my father. By 2 o'clock, Gerald Richardson was in the building for the first time in 6 weeks, moving through the hallways with the compressed, purposeful energy of a man who has just been reminded that he built something and is not yet ready to watch it be destroyed. He did not stop at my office. He went directly to Colton's. I know what was said in that meeting because Dennis Park, who had been asked to join and then quietly excused when the conversation became personal, told me afterward in the parking garage, in a low voice, with the look of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long, and had finally found someone he trusted to set it down with. Gerald had asked Colton directly whether he had read the full deal documentation before signing the letter of intent. Colton had said he had reviewed the executive summary. Gerald had asked about the regulatory inquiry representations. Colton had said he had relied on the legal team's sign-off. Gerald had asked who on the legal team had signed off. There had been a silence. The answer, Dennis told me, was that the standard legal review had been abbreviated at Colton's instruction in the interest of moving quickly, because Greer had represented that two other firms were also considering the co-investment and the window was closing. Richardson Capital had committed $14 million to a deal that had not received full legal due diligence because Colton had been in a hurry and had trusted a man he had met 4 times. Dennis finished telling me this and looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage. "How bad is the exposure?" I asked. "We're not going to lose the full 14, he said, but we're going to lose something. Legal thinks between 4 and 6 million, depending on how the unwinding goes." I nodded. I thanked him. I drove home. That evening, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It said, "Call me when you have a moment. Private matter, see." I stared at it for a long time. Then I called Patricia. "He wants to talk," I said. "About what?" "I don't know yet, but I think I should find out." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "If this is what I think it is," she said carefully, "you are going to want a record, I know. Your phone's call recorder needs to be enabled before you dial." "I know, Patricia, and whatever he offers, Heather, whatever number he puts on the table, do not say yes or no in that call. Say you'll think about it." "I know." I enabled the recorder. I called the number. Colton picked up on the second ring. He sounded different than he did in the office. Quieter, the performance register turned down to something closer to actual. He asked how I was. I said fine. A pause, and then he moved to it with the directness of someone who had rehearsed the approach and decided the shortest path was the least painful. "I need your help," he said. I waited. "The Greer situation is bad. Dad is... It's a difficult conversation. The board meeting is in 3 weeks and I need the numbers to look better than they do." "I can't change the numbers, Colton. I'm not asking you to change them. I'm asking you to frame them. You're good at that. The Meridian turnaround. The way you've presented that to people, you make things look manageable." "Meridian is manageable," I said, "because it actually is." A pause. "Right," he shifted. "Look, I know things haven't been. I know the gala was hard. For you. And I know the 21 dinner, what I said. That was wrong of me. That was out of line." I said nothing. "I want to make that right," he said. "I've been thinking about the structure of the senior team, and I think there's a case for a COO role. Someone who can manage the operational side formally, with real authority, real reporting lines. The kind of role you should have had from the beginning." I let the silence run for several seconds. "What would that involve?" I said. 10% equity grant, he said, vesting over 4 years. COO title, seat at the senior table, full operational authority over the portfolio companies. Another pause. "I need you on my side for the board meeting, Heather. With you presenting alongside me, the story looks different. The board trusts you." He was right that the board trusted me. He was wrong about almost everything else. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course," he said. "Take a few days. I'll come back to you by the end of the week." We said goodnight. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in my kitchen, the recording running its final seconds, the room very quiet around me. Then I called Patricia. 10% equity grant, I said. "He must be frightened," she said. "He is." I paused. "Patricia, how does a 10% grant interact with the Clearwater position?" A brief silence while she thought. "At current valuation, a 10% grant would make you the second largest individual shareholder in Richardson Capital, behind Gerald and ahead of anyone else, and if it were combined with the Clearwater position." "Combined," she said slowly, "you would hold 24.7% of the firm's outstanding equity." I let that sit for a moment. "Patricia," I said, "what does the shareholder agreement say about the threshold for calling a special board meeting?" I heard her open a document on her end, the rustle of pages, or perhaps the click of a keyboard. 20%, she said quietly. "Any shareholder, or group of shareholders, holding 20% or more of outstanding equity may formally petition the board to convene a special meeting." I looked at my kitchen table. The Meridian folder was still there, as it always was. Thinner now. The chaos of November replaced by order, by performance reports, by federal contract compliance filings, by the steady, unremarkable documentation of a company that had been given a chance and had not wasted it. I'm not going to take the equity grant, I said. Patricia paused. No, no. If I take it from Colton, the 14 from phone sentence looks like a coordinated play, and the board will spend 6 weeks untangling the optics instead of focusing on what actually matters. I paused. What I'm going to do is disclose the Clearwater position to the board directly. Before the November 14th Shump meeting, formally in writing through the company secretary, that gives the board 2 weeks' notice. Yes. And the recording? I'll have a transcript prepared and included in the disclosure package. The full package goes to Elena Marsh, Howard Klein, and the third independent, copied to the company's secretary and outside counsel. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Heather, she said. Your father is going to be in that room. I know, this will change things between you permanently, whatever happens after. The dynamic with Gerald, the family. It will be different. I thought about the gala, the burgundy carpet, the harbor painting. I thought about Sunday dinners in the Hamptons, and a single sentence. You have good instincts, delivered like something slightly embarrassing. Patricia, I said. It's already different. It's been different for a long time. I'm just the only one who has been honest about it, she exhaled. All right, she said. I'll draft the disclosure letter tonight. You'll have it by morning. I said goodnight and hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a while longer, in the quiet of it, listening to the particular silence of a house where only one person lives, and every decision is entirely your own. Then I opened my laptop and began preparing for November 14th. The disclosure letter went to Elena Marsh, Howard Klein, and the third independent board member, a former federal judge named Arthur Beale. On the morning of November 1st, delivered simultaneously to their personal email addresses and via certified mail to their home addresses. Because Patricia believed in redundancy, and I had come to believe in Patricia, the letter was 4 pages. It disclosed the Clearwater advisory position, the complete acquisition history of the 14.7% stake, the valuation methodology, the arm's length documentation, and the full legal basis for the timing of disclosure. Attached to it were the transaction records, the Clearwater formation documents, Patricia's legal opinion, and a separate sealed envelope containing the transcript and audio file of the October call with Colton, clearly labeled, with a cover note explaining that it was being provided for the board's considerations, and not as an accusation but as context. The fifth attachment was the Meridian Performance Report, the one Colton had asked me to delay. 12 pages, federal contract status, current fully compliant, Q3 EBITDA of $487,000, ahead of internal projections by 23%, cash position improved by $1. $1 million since February. Roy Delaney's operational summary, written in his plain, exact language, included at the back. I sent it at 7:42 in the morning, and then drove to Meridian. I spent 3 days in New Jersey that week. I had learned, over the course of that year, that the best place to wait for things you cannot control is somewhere the work is real, and the results are visible, and Roy Delaney will hand you a cup of coffee, without asking whether you want one. We reviewed the Q4 routing schedules. We talked about hiring. Meridian needed 2 additional operations coordinators to handle the federal contract volume, and Roy had identified 3 candidates he wanted me to meet. I met them. I made offers to 2 of them on Thursday afternoon, sitting in Roy's office, while he pretended to review freight manifests, and actually watched to see how I handled it. Howard Klein called me on Wednesday evening. He did not ask questions. He said he had reviewed the materials thoroughly and had spoken with Elena and Arthur. He said the board was taking the matter seriously. He said the November 14th meeting agenda had been revised and that my attendance was requested, not as a presenter, but as a shareholder with 14.7%, he said. Yes, I said, a pause. Heather, I want to ask you something directly, please. Did you acquire this position with the intention of using it to force a board action? I had thought about this question before he asked it. I had thought about it the way you think about questions that matter, not to find the most defensible answer, but to find the true one. I acquired this position, I said, because I believed the firm was being undervalued by people who were not paying attention to it. That belief has proven correct. What the board does with the information I've provided is the board's decision, not mine. I have not petitioned for a special meeting. I have not made demands. I disclosed the position because the shareholder agreement requires it before the November meeting, and I am complying with that requirement." Howard Klein was quiet for a moment. "That is a very precise answer," he said. "It is the accurate one," I said. Another pause. "We'll see you on the 14th, he said. I thanked him and hung up and sat for a while in Meridian's parking lot in the November dark, the facility lit up behind me, a truck pulling out of the yard with its running lights amber in the black air, heading somewhere north on Route 1, with a load that was part of a federal contract that had not existed a year ago. November 14th was a Thursday. The Richardson Capitol boardroom was on the 22nd floor of a glass building in Stamford, with a view on clear days of Long Island Sound in the distance, a pale silver strip that appeared and disappeared depending on the season and the weather and what you were willing to look for. That morning the sky was low and gray, and the Sound was not visible. The room held a long oval table, 12 chairs, 2 credenzas, and a whiteboard that was always clean because the cleaning staff came through at 6 in the morning and nobody ever left anything on it they needed to keep. I arrived at 8:45. The meeting was at 9. Colton was already there when I walked in. He was standing near the credenza with a cup of coffee, talking to Dennis Park in the low, rapid way of someone working through a problem they have not yet solved. He looked up when I entered. Something shifted in his face. A compression, a reassessment, the quick recalculation of a person who has just understood that the variables are not what they thought they were. He did not speak to me. I took a seat on the left side of the table, 3 chairs from the head. I set my leather portfolio on the table in front of me. I did not open it. My father arrived at 8:52. He came through the door with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided what he is going to do and is simply allowing time to reach the point where he does it. He looked at Colton. He looked at Dennis. Then he looked at me. And it was a longer look than I had received from him in many years. Not warm, not cold, but the look of a man in the process of updating an understanding he had held for a long time, and finding the revision uncomfortable. He sat down at the head of the table without speaking to any of us. Alina, Howard, and Arthur arrived together at 8:58 in a cluster that was not accidental. They had clearly spoken before entering. Alina nodded at me as she took her seat. Howard sat directly across from me. Arthur, who had the stillness of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms, waiting for the moment that mattered, took the chair at the far end and folded his hands on the table and looked at nothing in particular. The meeting was called to order at 9:04. Howard Klein, as lead independent director, took the chair. Gerald, for the first time in the history of Richardson Capitol board meetings, did not sit at the head. He had moved himself 2 seats down, at Howard's request, a procedural decision that took 30 seconds and rearranged everything. The agenda had 3 items. The first was a review of the Greer Capital situation. Losses, legal exposure, the path to resolution. Dennis presented this in 22 minutes. The number he landed on for projected loss was $5.4 million, at the midpoint of the legal team's range. Colton did not present. Colton sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the materials in front of him. The second agenda item was a review of Clearwater Advisory's disclosed position in Richardson Capital Group and its implications for the firm's shareholder structure. Howard introduced it. He summarized the disclosure letter, factually and completely. He noted the arm's-length acquisition, the compliance with disclosure requirements, and the timing. He noted the audio transcript of the October conversation, which the board had reviewed in advance, and stated that the board had determined it raised concerns under the firm's related party conduct policy. Colton's head came up when Howard mentioned the transcript. He looked at me. It was the first time since I had walked into the room that he had looked at me directly. His face had the quality of a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. The color had gone out of it in the way that color leaves a face when the blood has moved somewhere more urgent. I looked back at him. I held his gaze for exactly as long as it took for him to look away, which was not very long. The third agenda item was leadership. Howard presented it with the care of a man who had drafted the language himself and revised it several times. The board had reviewed the totality of the information available to it: the Greer situation, the dissolution of the risk committee, the renovation expense classification, the related party conduct issue raised by the October transcript, and the comparative performance of the firm's divisions over the preceding 12 months. The board proposed a resolution. Colton Richardson would step down from the role of CEO, effective immediately. and would be offered a non-executive advisory position pending further review of his conduct under the firm's governance policies. Heather Richardson would be appointed acting CEO, effective immediately, pending a formal executive search process in which she would be eligible to be considered as a permanent candidate. Howard called the vote. Alina Marsh. Yes. Arthur Beale. Yes. Howard Klein. Yes. The two remaining board members, both long-tenured and alert to the direction of things. Yes and yes. Gerald Richardson sat at his seat 2 chairs from the head of the table he had built. His hands were on the table in front of him, flat and still the way my hands had been flat and still at the gala a year ago, while 200 people applauded his son. He did not vote. Founders do not vote on board resolutions at Richardson Capital. That had been a governance decision my father had made himself 20 years ago, precisely to prevent any single person from having too much control. The irony of it, I think, was not lost on him. The vote was 7-1. The single dissenting vote was Colton's, cast in the tight, precise way of a man who knows the outcome and is voting anyway, because it is the only thing left to do. Howard declared the resolution passed and looked at me. Heather, he said. The board would welcome a few words from the acting CEO. I looked around the table. I looked at Elena, who was watching me with the calm expression of someone who has done what she came to do. I looked at Arthur Beale, who had unfolded his hands and placed them in his lap, and was looking at me with the attentiveness of a man hearing a closing argument he expects to be good. I looked at Dennis Park, who was not a board member and had no vote, and was sitting along the wall in one of the observer chairs, and whose expression was the most unguarded thing in the room. I looked at my father. Gerald Richardson was looking at me too. He had been looking at me, I realized, since Howard had spoken my name. Not with the brief, glancing attention of a man confirming a fact, but with the long revised, uncomfortable look of a man who has just understood something that has been true for some time. I thought of many things I could say. I said very few of them. Thank you, I said. I'd like to start with Meridian. The room held its breath for a moment after I spoke, that particular stillness that settles when something has shifted and everyone present knows it, but nobody has yet said so out loud. Then Howard Klein made a small note on the legal pad in front of him, and Elena uncapped her pen, and the meeting resumed in the efficient, forward-facing way of people who have made a decision and are ready to work. I spent 12 minutes on Meridian, not because it was the most pressing issue. It was not. The Greer unwinding was, and everyone in the room knew it. But I had learned, from 5 years of watching my father run meetings, that the first thing you put on the tables sets the register for everything that follows. I wanted the first thing to be a company that had been written off and had instead produced $487,000 in EBITDA in a single quarter. I wanted the first thing to be evidence that the methodology I intended to apply to Richardson Capital's portfolio was not theoretical. I walked through the federal contract, the Q3 numbers, the Q4 projections, the 2 new hires. I talked about Roy Delaney for approximately 90 seconds. Who he was, how long he had been there, what he had maintained under circumstances that did not reward maintenance. I said that the most important asset in any turnaround is the person who stayed when leaving would have been easier, and that Richardson Capital's first order of business at Meridian should be ensuring Roy Delaney's compensation reflected the value he had been generating without recognition for 11 years. Elena wrote something down. Then I moved to Greer. Dennis Park had covered the numbers, so I did not repeat them. What I did instead was walk the board through the process failure, not to assign blame, because the resolution on that question had already been passed, but because a process failure without a corrective framework is just an anecdote. I proposed reinstating the risk committee, with expanded scope and a direct reporting line to the audit committee, rather than to the CEO. I proposed a revision to the capital expenditure approval threshold, lowering it from $2 million to $750,000 for maintenance classifications. I proposed a mandatory outside counsel review for any co-investment involving a new counterparty. Regardless of deal size, the 3 independents asked questions. Good questions, specific ones, the kind that come from people who have read everything carefully and want to understand the thinking behind the proposal rather than the proposal itself. I answered them. Arthur Beale asked 2 follow-up questions that required me to think before responding, which I appreciated. A board that asks hard questions is the only kind worth having. Throughout all of this, Colton sat at the table. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. He did not leave. He did not make a scene. He sat with his hands flat on the table the way he had sat since the vote, and he looked at the materials in front of him. And he was very still in the way that people are still, when stillness is the only remaining form of dignity available to them. I did not look at him often. When I did briefly, I felt something that was not quite sympathy, and not quite its opposite. Something more complicated than either, the feeling of watching a person encounter the full weight of a consequence they constructed themselves. It was my father I watched. When I watched anyone, Gerald Richardson sat 2 chairs from the head of his own table and listened to his daughter run a board meeting in the building he had paid for. And his face across the course of that 2-hour session went through a sequence of expressions that I will not pretend to have fully read. There was something early that looked like resistance. Something in the middle that I would describe, if I had to, as the adjustment a person makes when they realize that the map they have been using is wrong, and the territory is what it is regardless. And something near the end. When I was laying out the Q1 priorities and the board was responding with the engaged, specific attention of people who believed in the plan, that I did not have a clean word for, it was not pride, it was more like recognition. The particular recognition of a person who built something and is watching it be handled correctly, and is in the process of understanding that they are not the one doing the handling. The meeting concluded at 11:47. Howard formally adjourned. People began collecting their materials. Dennis Park crossed the room toward me, hand extended, and shook mine with both of his, in a grip that communicated more than professional respect. Elena said she would have the revised governance framework on her desk by end of week and would schedule a call. Arthur Beale, on his way past, paused and said, simply, "Well done," in the tone of a man who does not say it often and means it when he does. Colton left without speaking to anyone. He stood, gathered his folder, buttoned his jacket, and walked out through the glass door with the controlled pace of someone managing the distance between the table and the exit, as though it were the last performance he had to give. The door closed behind him. Nobody tracked it with their eyes. Nobody except my father. Gerald watched the door close after his son and sat for a long moment in the chair he had moved himself into at Howard's request. Then he stood slowly, with the deliberate effort of a man who had been sitting still for a long time and found the getting up harder than it used to be. He put on his jacket. He looked across the emptying room to where I was speaking with Howard and waited with the patience of a man who had learned, perhaps only recently, that waiting was sometimes the appropriate posture. Howard excused himself. My father came across the room. He stood in front of me for a moment. Up close, he looked older than he had at the gala, or perhaps he had been this age at the gala, and I had not been looking for it. His hair was the same silver, his posture was the same. But something in the area around his eyes had changed, some holding quality gone out of it. He said, "You've been preparing for this for a long time." It was not quite a question. "Since the gala," I said. He nodded. "I should have seen it." I looked at him. "Which part?" He was quiet for a moment. "All of it," he said. "The Meridian thing. All of it." He paused again. "You didn't tell me, no," I said. "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without being cruel about it. Because the truth was not cruel, but it was not comfortable either. Because if I had told you, I said, you would have tried to manage it. And I needed to do it without being managed. He looked at me for a long time. The room had mostly emptied out now. The gray November light came flat through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sound was still not visible. "Richardson Capital," he said. "What are you going to do with it?" "Grow it," I said. "The way it should have been growing for the last 12 months. He nodded once. Then he did something he had not done since I was very young. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you touch something you are acknowledging. Not an apology. Something more structural than an apology. An acknowledgement of a fact that had been true for some time and was now simply being stated. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked to the door. He had his hand on it when Colton came back through. I do not know what Colton had been doing in the corridor for the preceding 20 minutes. Composing himself, perhaps, revising what he planned to say. He came through the door with the heightened energy of someone who has convinced themselves on the other side of it that there is still a conversation to be had, that the room is willing to be re-entered on different terms. He saw my father first. Then he saw me. He said my name. I looked at him. "This isn't," he started. He stopped. "Tried again. The board doesn't have the full picture. There are things about the Greer deal that weren't in the presentation, context that Dennis didn't cover, and if you would just..." "Colton," I said. He stopped. The board has the full picture, I said. I made certain of that. His face did something complicated. The charm register was gone, not suppressed, actually gone, the way a signal disappears when the transmitter is switched off. What was left underneath was younger than I expected and more tired. He looked briefly like the boy he had been before the firm became something he was owed. "I'm your brother," he said. It came out quietly, without strategy, and I think it was the most honest thing he said to me in the entirety of that year. "I know," I said. "So what happens now?" I held his gaze. "The governance committee will review your conduct under the firm's policies. That process will take the time it takes, and it will be fair, because that is how we do things here." I paused. "And then we'll see." He looked at me for another moment. Then he looked at my father, who was still standing at the door, watching. Gerald Richardson did not say anything. He held his son's gaze with the look of a man who has run out of interventions and is learning, late, that this too is a form of love. Colton left, the door closed. My father and I stood in the empty boardroom for a moment, the two of us and the long oval table and the 12 chairs and the gray November sky through the glass. "Heather," he said, "Dad." He nodded once more and walked out. I stood alone in the room. I looked at the table, the papers, the water glasses, the notepads with their careful writing. I looked at the chair at the head of it, which was empty, which had been empty since Howard had restructured the seating at 9 o'clock this morning. I walked to it. I pulled it out. I sat down. Outside, somewhere below in the parking garage, an engine started. Then another. The building settled into its ordinary Thursday sounds: phones, an elevator, the distant percussion of someone's keyboard through a wall. I opened my leather portfolio to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. Then I began writing the list of things that needed doing. 18 months is not a long time in private equity. It is, in the life of a firm, barely a chapter, a single fund cycle, a handful of exits, the arc of maybe 2 or 3 deals from sourcing to close. But 18 months is long enough to establish a direction. Long enough for a direction to become a culture. Long enough for the people inside an organization to understand, without being told directly, what is valued and what is not, and to begin orienting themselves accordingly. This is what I learned in the 18 months after November 14th. I was confirmed as permanent CEO of Richardson Capital Group in February, following a formal search process in which I was one of 4 candidates considered by the board. I present that fact without editorializing, because I think it matters that I went through the process. Howard Klein had offered, in December, to recommend waiving it given the circumstances. I declined. I wanted the job the way it was supposed to be gotten. Competed for, evaluated, given on merit. I won it on merit. The board voted unanimously. The first thing I did as permanent CEO was call Roy Delaney, not with instructions or a strategy agenda. I called him to tell him that Meridian Logistics was no longer going to be a portfolio holding. It was going to be a subsidiary, fully integrated, with its own P&L line in the Richardson Capital Annual Report and its own seat at the operational table. I told him his title was changing to President of Meridian Operations. I told him his compensation was changing too, in a way that reflected what he had actually been doing for 11 years, rather than what the org chart had previously acknowledged. He was quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Richardson," he said finally. "Heather," I said. "We've been doing this for a year." "Heather," he said. He cleared his throat. Thank you. You kept the lights on when nobody was watching," I said. "That's the hardest thing there is." We extended the GSA contract in March, adding 2 new delivery corridors that brought the total contract value to $24.7 million. By the following autumn, Meridian was generating $2.3 million in annual EBITDA and had expanded its workforce to 26 people. Roy hired a deputy operations manager and began, for the first time in his career, leaving the office before 7. At Richardson Capital proper, the changes took longer and required more patience, which is true of all cultural changes in organizations that have been running a particular way for a long time. I reinstated the Risk Committee in January, expanded its membership to 5, and gave it genuine authority, the kind with budget and escalation rights and a direct line to the Audit Committee that did not pass through the CEO's office. Dennis Park came into my office the week after the appointment letter went out and sat across from my desk. The mahogany one, my father's desk, which I had kept because it had been in the building since the beginning, and I saw no reason to replace things that worked. And said, with the directness of a man who had spent 12 months choosing his words carefully and was ready to stop doing that he was glad. I told him I was glad too, The Greer unwinding settled in April at $4.9 million, the lower end of the legal range. Patricia Wald negotiated the settlement structure. We recovered approximately $1. $2 million through the insurance policy that Dennis had, to his quiet credit, insisted on maintaining even after Colton had questioned its cost. The net loss to the firm was $3.7 million, real money, consequential money, but not the kind that changes the trajectory of an organization that is otherwise pointed correctly. By the second quarter, Richardson Capital had its best fund performance in 6 years. By the third, we had closed 2 new portfolio company acquisitions, both sourced through relationships I had built over the preceding 18 months. One through Howard Klein's network, one through a connection I had made at an industry conference the previous spring, a woman named Sarah Chen who ran a manufacturing company in Ohio and had been looking for a patient capital partner for 2 years, and had found, in every previous conversation with private equity firms, a version of the same impatience dressed in different suits. She called me after the conference. We talked for an hour. We closed the deal in 11 weeks. The firm's assets under management crossed $1.5 billion in November. The first time in Richardson Capital's history, I told my father at Thanksgiving. We were at the Hamptons' house. A smaller gathering than usual, just family. The kind of Thanksgiving that happens after a year that has rearranged things. My mother made the turkey and refused help with the same cheerful stubbornness she had applied to all domestic decisions for 40 years. My father sat at the table, in the chair he had always sat in, at the head of it, which in the Hamptons' house was still his, by simple fact of habit, and I had no desire to change it. After dinner, when my mother had gone inside and the table held only the remnants of the meal, and the two of us in the cooling November air off the water, I told him. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the Sound, visible from here, gray-green, the last light going. 1991, he said. We were at 200 million our first full year, I know. Took us 12 years to hit $1 billion. I know. He nodded slowly. The water moved. A bird crossed the sky at the edge of the property, low and purposeful, heading somewhere specific. You're going to take it further than I did, he said. It was not a question. That was always the plan, I said. He looked at me. And then for the first time in my adult life, not at a board meeting, not in a performance review, not in a corridor with 30 seconds and the correct professional register, my father smiled at me the way he smiled at Colton, the full one. The one that reached his eyes and stayed there. I know, he said. I should have seen it sooner. I did not say anything. I let the acknowledgement be what it was, without adding to it or diminishing it, because some things are most themselves when you leave them alone. As for Colton, the governance committee completed its review in March. The findings were not criminal. Nothing Colton had done crossed the line into the territory that requires law enforcement, though the related party conduct issue came close enough that outside counsel had spent 2 careful months with the documentation. What the findings did establish was a pattern of process violations significant enough to trigger the provision in the shareholder agreement that allowed the board to repurchase shares from a holder found to have breached their governance obligations. At a formula price that was, by design, below market, Colton's shares were repurchased in April. He received $2.3 million for a stake that, at the firm's current valuation, was worth closer to $4.1 million. The difference was the cost of the year. He understood that. He did not contest it. Patricia had told me he had consulted 2 attorneys who had both told him the same thing. The provision was valid, the process had been followed, and a challenge would be expensive and would fail. He called me once. In May, he asked how the firm was doing. I told him it was doing well. He said that was good. I asked how he was. He said he was figuring things out, which I thought was probably the most honest answer he had ever given me. He mentioned Austin, the city he had been in before joining the firm, the loose consulting work, the friend's startup. He thought he might go back. Try something smaller, he said. Something where he could actually learn rather than just lead. I told him that sounded right. We talked for 11 minutes. It was not warm, and it was not cold, and it was the beginning of something that might, over years and with patience, become the ordinary version of a sibling relationship. Not close, not estranged, simply 2 people who share a history and have decided to be decent about it. I did not forgive him that day. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not a decision you make on a phone call in May. It is something that happens slowly, in the background, while you are doing other things. while you are running a firm and hiring good people and calling Roy Delaney to tell him his title has changed and sitting at a Thanksgiving table while the light goes out over the sound. It accumulates, quietly the way most things that last accumulate, without announcement, without drama, just the steady, ordinary work of a life being built correctly. Clearwater Advisory LLC still holds its 14.7% of Richardson Capital Group. I have no plans to change that. It is, after all, a good investment. Here is what I want to leave you with. There is a particular kind of strength that the world does not always recognize because it does not make noise. It does not argue at the dinner table, or raise its voice at the gala, or send the email it is tempted to send at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. It shows up, it documents, it builds quietly and correctly in the spaces that other people have decided are not worth their attention. And then it waits, not passively, not without purpose, but with the deliberate patience of someone who understands that the most powerful position you can occupy is the one that is simply, undeniably correct. You do not have to perform your worth for people who have decided not to see it. You only have to build it. And keep building it until the evidence is too large to ignore. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been the person in the room who knew the most and was thanked the least, leave a comment below and tell me about it. I read every single one, and if you are not yet subscribed, the button is right there because this is not the only story I have to tell, and the next one starts the same way this one did, with a decision that nobody else noticed.